YXBA is back, and I'm ready to mash some more buttons.
Tiger uppercut!
So recently I've come across various reports that Nintendo has been able to secure great chips for the NX at a great price. And while I'm not able to independently verify the validity of these reports, whether they're accurate or not, I wanted to discuss whether it's even hypothetically possible and whether it even makes sense for Nintendo to be getting great chips at a great price without having to resort to Doritos. So all the reports out there have been indicating that it is highly likely that Nintendo is going to be going with an AMD APU and quite possibly something built off of the Polaris architecture that AMD has coming out in the near future. And the exciting thing about going in this direction is that the NX would potentially have a much more modern architecture than you see in the PlayStation 4 OG and the original Xbox One. And the benefit to having a more modern architecture is with that, you typically get more features and more efficiency created. So even if you have the same specs as another console, if the architecture is more modern, you should be able to get more results out of the same amount of power, which I think is always a good thing and something that you should be striving for. But what I really want to talk about is how it be possible that Nintendo could be getting such a good deal on these chips. I mean, from a pessimistic viewpoint, you would ask yourself, like, why would Nintendo be getting maybe perhaps a better deal than what PlayStation and Microsoft get? After all, PlayStation and Microsoft are well established in this console generation and are having very high quantity of orders, particularly PlayStation. So if anything, a basic rule of thumb is the more you order, the better price you get. But the fact is that there can be more to business than that. It seems like typically in business, when you're dealing with a new client or from a position of weakness, the tendency is to want to give the best deal at the beginning of that relationship to make sure that you secure that business. And then typically as time goes by, the supplier of a service will feel that they have built up a certain level of trust and they have built up perhaps somewhat of a codependency together and are able to perhaps increase the profits going forward once the supplier feels like they are in more of a position of strength and control over that business relationship. So in the context of supplying chips for consoles, there's been a lot of interesting articles written on this, but it seems like AMD is largely taking over and putting themselves into a position of power over PlayStation and over Xbox. I read a recent article today from Digital Foundry where it was suggested that Microsoft and Sony are a little bit hamstrung at this point in that they have to wait for AMD to come out with newer and better chips that are specifically designed to be small enough and efficient enough to work on consoles, but also have considerable graphics potential. And for them to, at this point, make a switch and go to a completely different architecture, maybe from NVIDIA, for example, it would mean that there would be a significant loss of backwards compatibility and is not something that would be very friendly to video game developers. So there's a lot of reason to believe that at this point, once AMD got in there with these new APUs, that they have put themselves into a slightly more of a position of control over that business. But considering that Nintendo is coming out with a new console that's all new, hypothetically Nintendo could go with a variety of suppliers for the chips in the NX. There's not a ton of options, but certainly Nvidia would be one of those. And I think that at this point, AMD is looking to the future, and if they can get all three major console manufacturers running very similar architectures, that's going to be something that's going to be really, really friendly to the third-party developers. And the pressure at that point is going to be on the console manufacturers to continue down AMD's line of chips in the future, because the developers are going to quite enjoy this situation of easy porting between the different platforms, and it will be very difficult to break away from this situation once it is locked in. So by that token, I think it's really important for AMD to get Nintendo locked down, especially if Nintendo is able to have a successful go of the NX console. So for that reason, as Nintendo is basically a free agent right now, I can see why the deal they would be getting could be pretty good. To make a sports reference, I think it's a well-known fact that players that play for the team that drafted them, typically they don't get quite as much money as a player that hits the free agent market and goes for the best possible deal. But there's typically reasons why, emotional reasons to stay with the team that drafted you. So to the point that Microsoft and Sony have more of a history of selling large quantities of consoles and should deserve a better price point from AMD, I would point to the potentiality that the NX handheld would also be using chips from AMD. And if you combine those two deals together, Nintendo has put themselves into a position where they can demand a very good price point, because I believe the worst generation that they've ever had when you combine the hardware together of the handheld and the console will probably be looking in the range of 70 to 80 million units, and in a successful generation, potentially Nintendo could go to 200, 250 million units, which is huge potential. AMD would really be kicking themselves if they did not get in on that action, and Nintendo had a highly successful or even an average Nintendo generation in terms of handheld and console sales. Another common business practice, which leads me to believe that Nintendo could be getting a good deal on these chips, is that when you have a new technology such as Polaris, it's really important to get some deals early on and really show off to the rest of the world what your hardware is capable of. So, by that token, I think that you can see that, when it comes to Google search engine, remember how, eventually they got really, really popular because a lot of early adopters were using it and recommending it, and pretty soon they just became the standard. And it's hard to imagine a time when Google would not be the dominant search engine in the industry. And the same philosophy has occurred time and time again with chip manufacturers who have been eager to show off what their new technology can do, and also make their technology become a standard, so that in the future you could actually see this growing into a situation where for PC GPUs, AMD may become more of a standard, because games are going to be highly optimized for AMD, considering all the hundreds of millions of consoles that are all going to be potentially using AMD. So they could slowly eat away at the dominant position that Nvidia is on the PC side of things by dominating all console GPUs. So give me your thoughts on this video. I just want to remind you again, this is not a piece about me having inside sources. This is simply me hypothesizing of why it actually might not be that shocking that Nintendo gets a very good deal on the chips that will power the Nintendo NX. This has been Colin Unger, reminding you to keep your thumbs glued to YXBA, and always remember to select Start. If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe.